Hi guys, welcome to a new video. If you're new to my channel, my name's Lindsay, and today I'm going to take you all the way back to the early 1900s back in Europe to talk about the last publicly executed man in France. The man in question is Eugene Weidmann, who was born on the 5th of February 1908 in Frankfurt am Main in Germany. He didn't stay there very long because when World War I started, he was sent to live with his grandparents in Cologne, and once the war ended, he moved back to his parents and then lived in Canada for a little bit, came back to Germany, and then moved to France. Now let's fast forward to 1937. The Universal Exposition is happening in Paris, and Eugene Weidmann is 29 years old. In November 1937, the exposition has already come to an end, and a real estate agent goes missing. Now, this is highly unusual. He went to a viewing for a villa, and when he doesn't come back, his secretary gets quite worried. So she does contact the police because he's still not back from that viewing. So the next day, the police go and check the villa, and when they get there, they find Raymond Le Sobre dead in the basement. He had been shot in the back of the head, and all of his pockets were turned out, suggesting that it was a robbery. They end up heading back to the agency to try and find out a little bit more about how this could have happened. They speak to the secretary and ask them if she saw the person he was on his last viewing with, and she explains that she never did see him, neither did Raymond Le Sobre. He only spoke to him over the phone, but he did mention that the man had a German accent and that he also left behind a business card. They check out the business card, and it's in the name of Arthur Fritz, who is a lingerie representative who is based in the east of France. Now, they do contact him, but when they question him, they find out that he was nowhere near Paris when this happened. He was actually in a business meeting, and he had witnesses to testify that, so it couldn't have been him. And to be honest, Arthur Fritz is a bit confused as to how his business card could have ended in a real estate agency all the way in Paris, because he'd only had those business cards printed recently and he never really went to Paris. So he was a bit interested in how this could have happened, and then he did remember handing some out to his nephew, Fritz Frommer, who did live in Paris. The police get the address, they rush back to Paris to try and intercept him, but when they get to the hotel where Fritz was living, they find that it's empty. They speak to the concierge, who says he did used to live here, but he hasn't been here in 8 days, which is exactly when Raymond Le Sobre was murdered. They do a little bit of digging, and they find out that Fritz had a form of assistant by the name of Carrère. Now, they have no issue locating Carrère. He lives in a gorgeous villa just outside of Paris, so they make their way to the villa, and the first thing they notice is 2 cars in the driveway that have identical license plates. Now, that's very unusual, because why would you have the same plate for 2 cars? That's not legal. The more troublesome part being that one of the cars is exactly the same as Raymond Le Sobre's car. So they think it's worth it to just stick around and find out if this Carrère is gonna come home. So they just decide to hang out for a little bit and wait for someone to come home. And not long after, a charming young man comes home, and he spots the police officers, and he doesn't seem to have any reaction. He's not stressed or worried. He's just making his way home. And he comes up to them and he says, "How can I help you?" And the officers don't want to blow their cover right away, so they decide to tell him that they're here to get more information about the tenants regarding taxes and contributions. So he lets them inside, and he gets a little bit suspicious, so he decides to ask them for their papers. Now, obviously, they're quite taken aback because it's a lie. They're police officers. They don't have papers to prove that they're who they said they were, so they have to give up the lie and show their police papers saying, "We're the police." And in return, they ask him, "Do you have papers on you? Can we get your identification?" And he smiles, reaches into his breast pocket, and pulls out a gun. And he just starts shooting. He gets one of the officers in the shoulder and then grazes the brow bone of the other officer. And they don't have any weapons on them, so they're fighting someone who's got a gun. And they actually manage to wrestle him, and there's a hammer nearby on a coffee table, and one of the officers just grabs it, bonks him on the head. he passes out and they manage to arrest him. So fast forward to the police station, they wrap up his head, they bandage his head up because they did hit him on the head with a hammer, but it wasn't hard enough to cause any damage. So they make sure he's fine and then decide to question him right away because they want answers. Like, he's already looking so suspicious. He has Raymond Le Sob's car in his driveway. The business card left behind at the real estate agency links back to him somehow. And on top of that, when they did search the house while arresting him, they found a golden lighter with the initials RL, Raymond Le Sobre, on them. So that could be his. And also, they found a bunch of fake IDs and fake paperwork that all had this Carrère picture on them, but none of them were his real name. They all had variants, so it's looking very suspicious. And to make things worse, he started attacking police officers the second he found out that they were police officers. So they start questioning him, and then he quickly confesses that his name is not Carrère, his name is Eugene Weidmann. And he is willing to talk, but he does ask the police for one night of sleep. So he just says, look, I'm willing to tell you everything I know, but just let me have this one night to get some rest, and I'll tell you everything in the morning. And they agree. Now, obviously, they don't let him go. He stays overnight in the cell. And after a long night's sleep, he comes back the next day, and he seems ready to talk. He starts by explaining that he had been stealing since he was very young. He started stealing back when he lived with his grandparents in Cologne, and then stole a little bit more, and he was about to get in trouble, so he ran away to Canada, where he did more stealing and actually did some jail time in Canada. And then when he moved back to Germany after his jail sentence, he got arrested. He gets sentenced to 5 years in jail. So he basically steals everywhere he goes and gets caught everywhere he goes. He's not very good at this. I mean, he gets caught every time. He gets sent to jail every time. But the police don't really care about these thefts. They're thinking, all right, that's cool, you're a thief, you go to jail, but what about this real estate agent we found dead? You know, that links back to you, what happened there? And Eugene just simply says, oh, yeah, I killed him. I shot him in the back of the head. So when they ask why, he says, well, I was just walking around town and the first shop I saw was this real estate agency and he was looking for some money. So he saw this Raymond Le Sobre and thought, he looks like someone who's got money on him. So he booked a viewing for a villa. And when they got there, they looked around the place, and then once they got to the basement, he shot him in the back of the head and then stole all of his money. Now at the time, Raymond only had about 5,000 francs on him, which in today's money is, I want to say, about 2,500 euros. It's really not a large sum of money, at least not enough to kill for. Not that there's a good amount to kill for, but it's just such a small amount of money. Maybe you could have just held him at gunpoint, steal the money, and ran. But instead of doing that, he just decided to shoot him dead and then steal his money. And then what he did was switch up the plates of Raymond's car and then drove it back home, which is why it was sitting in his driveway. Now, while he's confessing to this murder, he's explaining it as if someone else had done it. It's like he's telling a story, and you know, the officers didn't have to ask much for him to confess, but once he's done confessing, he just breaks down and starts crying. So what the police officers do is they tell him, you know, if you're too emotional to talk, you can just write down your confession. So they hand him some paper and a pen, and he only writes down one name, Jean de Koven. And the police cannot believe it. Like, this is a disappearance they've been looking to solve for the past 5 weeks. This is an American girl who'd gone missing in Paris, and this man wrote down her name on a piece of paper. He must know something about it. So they ask him a little bit more about what he knows, and he explains that one night he was hanging around a hotel bar looking for a potential victim to steal from when he met Jean de Koven, this American dancer who came all the way from the States for the Universal Exposition. She came with her aunt, and they came aboard a very, very fancy boat called the Normandy. And that's what gave it away to him that she was someone who would have money on her. So he keeps the charade going. He pretends he's this very bourgeois type of guy with lots of money. He's got this German accent. It's 1937, the Universal Exposition. She is charmed, he's attractive, he's very charismatic, and he offers her to show her around Paris, and she can't refuse. She thinks this is just too perfect to have this German guy showing me around Paris, and he's just so charming. So they travel back to his place so that they can pick up the car and he can drive her around. And once inside, I mean, he lives in a villa. She gets very excited. She decides to run around, kind of visit the place. She's just happy. She's having a good time. He offers her a glass of milk, but what she doesn't know is that he has added a sedative to the glass of milk, and she quickly passes out. Now, what Eugene explains after this is that he also fell asleep after she passed out, and he claims that when he woke up, she found her looking through his pockets and reaching out for his gun, and he strangles her. So initially he's just saying this is self-defense. I drugged her and then she reached for my gun and now I have to strangle her, self-defense. Which the police obviously have a hard time believing. She's got money, she would never go through his pockets, or maybe even if she did, like, if you find out someone's drugged you, that is self-defense, to kind of look for a weapon around and be like, what the hell, you just drugged me. But he ended up strangling her, and he tells the police she's buried on my property in a very shallow grave. You can find her easily. Now, what's so eerie about all of this is that she had a brand new camera at the time, and she took pictures of him before being drugged and before being strangled. So when the police found the camera, they could develop all the pictures, and they were all the pictures of his attacker, but she didn't know it at the time. Now, money-wise, just to make things clear, he did not initially want to murder her. He claims he was just looking to kidnap her in exchange for a ransom. Now, she only had $500 in traveler's checks on her, which is not a lot of money. Definitely not a lot worth stealing or worth, killing for. And her aunt only asked for $500 for any information. Whoever knows anything about my niece, here's $500, which again is not a lot of money. I'm not sure how much he thought he could get in exchange, for a ransom in exchange for Jean, but he only got $500 out of it. And same with the real estate agent, who only had 5,000 francs on him. It's really not a crazy sum of money. So the police are having a really hard time believing this guy would just go around killing people for such small amounts. It's just not worth it. You could just, you could just rob a gas station. I mean, it just seems a bit too crazy that he would just kill for a small amount of money. And also bear in mind, it's 1937. The political climate in France is very hectic, and this guy is German. So the police start thinking, maybe he's a German spy, maybe he's a Nazi spy, maybe there's more to this. How did he end up in France? Like, yes, he went to jail, but how did he end up back here? He's not even from here. So they ask him what he's doing in France, and Eugene explains that when he was in Germany in jail, he met 2 French inmates, and they started concocting plans together. And he basically joined them. As soon as his sentence was over, he joined them back in Paris. Now, their names are Roger Million and Jean Blanc, which seem like such comic book names. Like, you couldn't make them up any better. Like, Roger Million and Jean Blanc, I don't know. Maybe it's because they rhyme. So the police do check on this, and they do find out that those guys were in jail in Germany at the same time as he was, and once they speak to these accomplices, they find out that they were also involved in some of the crimes he committed. And as the interview keeps going, Eugene writes down 3 more names on the piece of paper, and police quickly realize these are not more accomplices, these are more victims. So there's more than the 2 he's confessed to. They originally only thought he was involved with 1, confessed to another, and now he's adding 3 names. The first name he wrote down was Joseph Koufi, who was just one of those drivers you could hire, but for long distances. He had a very fancy car, and you could hire these types of people to drive you across France. That was a thing you could do at the time. So he hired him to drive him all the way down to Nice. Somewhere along the way, the driver pulls over to urinate, and Eugene gets out of the car and shoots him in the back of the head. and steal all of his money, which was only 1,400 francs, so really not a large sum by any means. And he steals his car and brings it back to his house. And interestingly enough, that is the second car that's in his driveway. The Viva Stella limousine, which would stand out in anyone's driveway. It's a very peculiar car. But that is the second they find in the driveway. One of them is Joseph Kouffi's car, and then the other one was the real estate agent's car. The second name he writes down is Roger Leblanc, who he claims he actually didn't kill. He claims that his accomplice, Million, is the one who shot him. And then they ended up splitting the 5,000 francs he had on him. Now the third name written down on this piece of paper is Fritz Frommer, which is the same name that the lingerie representative gave the police, who was no longer at the hotel. They were saying, this man hasn't come back in 8 days. Now this one is different. Eugene actually knew him from back in prison, and he thought he knew too much, so he killed him to make sure that the secret wouldn't come out. So far Eugene has confessed to 5 murders willfully, without much prompting from the police. He's just giving these names out, and he's just confessing to having murdered them. Mostly for money. I mean, Fritz, I think, was mostly to shut him up because they were afraid that he was gonna blow their cover or start talking. He just knew too much. But everyone else, they seem to kill for money, and it's never a big sum of money. And he does remember a 6th name as police are interrogating him, and the 6th name being Janine Keller. And again, as with the other victims, he shot her in the back of the head and stole 100 francs she had on her. So it just seems odd, because he's not even, at this point, are you even looking for people who have money on them? It just seems like he's randomly killing anyone he can find and think they might have cash on them. I need cash right now. Now, all of these murders happened while the Universal Exposition is happening back in 1937. It is the perfect opportunity. It's busy, it's crowded, people might not notice people who are missing. People are coming from all over the world, and it does give you major like Devil in the White City vibes, if you've ever heard of this case. But it is the perfect environment for this type of activity because there's so much going on. However, the picture of him bandaged up gets leaked to the press, and people go insane. I mean, this is the biggest case at the time. This is something huge. This is someone who's admitted to having killed 6 people for money, and not even a large sum of money. But when the pictures come out, people realize he's quite attractive. He has a major Ted Bundy moment, even though Ted Bundy happened decades later. He just had the same response from people. This is a charming young man who is murdering rich people, or allegedly people who would have money. So this is someone who's just going around killing anyone who he thinks has money. What's so noticeable about him is that he's charming, he's young, and he's worryingly calm about confessing to all of these murders. And that's how he very quickly gets nicknamed the Velvet-Eyed Assassin. Now, the French Secret Services are very interested in him because they do not believe for 1 second he's going around killing people for 100 francs, 1,000 francs, 5,000 francs. It's just not a lot of money. It makes no sense. If you're willing to kill for money, you might just at least make sure you're going to get a huge reward in exchange. He seems to have absolutely no issue killing people or even confessing to the murders. He's just so unemotional about it. What the French Secret Services notice is that before leaving jail in Germany, he was interrogated by the Gestapo, which is, the Nazi police. And they're thinking there might be a link here. Why was he being questioned by them? Additionally to having been interrogated by the Gestapo, they find out that Fritz Frommer, who is the accomplice or jail inmate friend that they murdered, was initially jailed for having very anti-Nazi stances. He was Jewish, and he spoke very clearly about that, and that's why he had been jailed. So the police is thinking maybe that's why Eugene killed him. Maybe he is a Nazi spy and he's killing anyone who is anti-Nazi. So what they do is they end up asking him about the Gestapo questioning, and he just laughs it off. He's thinking, "Are you kidding? It's Germany. Everyone gets interviewed by them. It's just procedure. This is not that deep. That just happened." And they do try and get in touch. So they get in touch with his accomplices, Jean Blanc and Roger Million, who explain that they were involved to a certain extent. Jean Blanc mostly because he was bored. He just joined in because he had nothing better to do. And then Roger Million was way more involved. Now, he's the one that Eugene claims killed Jean Leblanc, if you remember. And Million denies that. He says Eugene did murder him. It wasn't him. So they're both kind of blaming each other for one of the murders. But overall, Eugene is the main one to kill people. But Roger Million is definitely involved in the organization of it. Now, because this case is absolutely huge, especially back in 1937, this is just front page for months. He has no trouble finding himself a lawyer, because people are fighting to defend him. He is the famous velvet-eyed assassin. And he doesn't end up with just any lawyer. He ends up with a lawyer named, I'm gonna have to read this off, it's such a long name, Vincent de Moreau-Giaferi. I'm gonna write it down. Vincent, who had previously defended Désiré Landru, who was the French Bluebeard, another massive case. So this lawyer is known throughout France, and he wants to defend Eugene Weidmann. He thinks he's the one for the job. So the court case begins 13th of March, 1939 in Versailles. If you recognize the name, it's because you've probably heard of the Versailles Castle. And throughout the court case, Eugene admits that his only regret is the pain he has caused his mother, but he is fully aware of what he's done. He's not trying to plead guilty. He's not trying to lessen his sentence. He's just waiting for the verdict. So because nobody was willing to believe that someone could just go around killing people for such small amounts of money, that's terrifying. It's less scary if it's something more organized, like someone who's getting millions for it, but someone who's willing to kill anyone who might have money on them now concerns everyone. And they just have a really hard time believing that someone that attractive, that charming, could be so cold and unemotional about killing for such a small amount of money. So they send in psychiatrists and psychologists to try and find out if he is fit for trial, if he's insane, or if there's any mental illness going on, because people just don't want to believe this is someone who's just roaming the streets. And although they do refer to him as a degenerate, they do confirm that he is not insane and that he is fit for trial. Now, none of the lawyers who have fought to defend him could ever save him from the death penalty. On March 31st, 1939, Eugene Weidmann and Roger Million both face the death penalty, and Jean Blanc faces 20 months in prison. Roger Million's sentence does end up being lessened to life in prison instead of the death penalty, but Eugene gets absolutely no grace. And on the 17th of June 1939, Eugene gets executed by a guillotine. Now, the execution was scheduled for 4:30 in the morning at daybreak, just to get it out of the way, but it does end up getting delayed by 45 minutes because there was such a big crowd. Or at least it was a big crowd at the time. Because this was one of the biggest cases, because everybody knew his name, and some of the women were absolutely obsessed with him because he was so charming, because he was so attractive. And everybody showed up, and that's what delayed the execution. They had to clear people to be able to execute this man. Now, what the government didn't know is that someone did film the event, and you can actually find this video on YouTube. It's a bit grainy. It's definitely not safe for work. Or not safe for life. I will link it down below if you're interested. It's not a close-up. It's kind of far away. It's black and white. It's just, I find it fascinating that someone ended up filming the last public execution in France. Now, it's not something I would recommend anyone watching, but if you are interested, the link's down below. Because it was such a public event and because it was such a big case, a lot of people took a lot of pictures. Now, a fun fact, I'm not sure how fun this is, but a fun fact about this is that Christopher Lee actually attended this event when he was 17. And it's kind of ironic because he did go on to play Charles-Henri Sanson, who is the royal executioner. So he witnessed this event, and then further on he played a role where he played the royal executioner for Louis XVI. Now, Albert Lebrun, who was the president at the time, was so appalled by the crowd's hysterical behavior at this beheading that he decided to ban all public executions from here on out. So after Eugene's execution, any execution that were to happen would be behind prison walls. And if you're wondering, I think a lot of you might be thinking, I didn't even know they were still, beheading people in 1939 in France. And actually the last guillotine execution in France was actually happened in the late 70s, the death penalty was only outlawed in 1981. I think a lot of people, myself included, just assumed the guillotine was like back when the kings were there, but it actually happened into the 1970s. But the last public execution was Eugene Weidmann in 1939, and people went absolutely crazy. I think this is such a fascinating case. I had never really heard of it until a few weeks ago, and yeah, he was kind of the original Ted Bundy, I guess. Not that that's something to brag about. I never understand how people could idolize serial killers. It just doesn't make sense to me. But I think it's just so fascinating to find out how he was just so quick to confess. He had no issues confessing. He didn't run away. He didn't even try to plead guilty. Nothing. He was just, I don't know, it just seemed so cold that he would just do that for such a small amount of money and then turn around and say, oh, you got me, I did all of this, and then gets executed in public, and people were going nuts. People were going insane for this. I think that's such an interesting case. Let me know down below if you like this. Please like and subscribe. This one was a bit shorter than the other ones, hopefully, and I will catch you next week for the next case. Bye.